What's up, everyone? Today's class is decoupling the hip from the spine. I have a focus class for you on just that. We're trying to build control of the hip without that spine compensation. Before we jump into a bunch of hip focus training, I want to start with a little bit of pelvis motion, a little bit of lumbar spine work to build that control of the lumbar spine, that awareness first. Then we'll jump into a hip focus series. Good one today. All you're going to need as far as equipment, maybe a ball, tennis ball, something like it, and then a yoga block. Probably all you're gonna need, some comfortable flooring as well. We need to talk about a little bit of pelvic rotation. It's a drill that oftentimes is confusing, so I feel it's best just to practice. But the idea, we've used this cue before, think of the pelvis, if it was facing forward as mine is right now, as the headlights of a car. We need those headlights to be squared forward so that we can disassociate, so we can decouple our hips. Very often, there will be a little bit of pelvic rotation. Instead of those pelvis points pointing forward, one will maybe veer off, pointing off to the side, and then we're going through our hip cars, our hip-specific training, you might notice that pelvic point is not squared up. So, same idea, we're gonna do some training to build some control and awareness of pelvic rotation so we can better decouple it from our hips. What we're going to do is actually lay down on the side, place the ball right in between the knees. In this position, you can bring the hand right on the point of the hip. The idea is we're trying to get a little bit of rotation by reaching one thigh forward and back. So laying on the side, try and ensure your ear, shoulder, and hip are in a straight line. A breath in and out. Try and reach the top knee forward. As you do that, notice the pelvis will have to rotate following along. Now reach that top thigh backwards, rolling the ball back. Now the pelvis will have to tilt towards the sky. Continue rotating and reaching back. Think about trying to keep the T-spine out of this. The chest is squared forward. The pelvis will lead, the low back will have to follow. Go slow. Rolling that ball forward, you're rolling the ball backwards. Okay, just gonna flip over. Let's get the opposite side. Backwards, pelvis will turn towards the sky. Continue. Very normal to feel that one side is much more clunky than the other. Could show in a moment if the hip rotation, if that internal rotation is limited on one side, you may see that pelvic control here very limited as well. Reaching and peeling back. Okay, next up, we're gonna come back over. Now, if I had another yoga block, I would place it right behind my low back, trying to block any motion of the lumbar spine. Remember that pelvic rotation? Pelvis point stays forward throughout. Ball's gonna go behind the knee. Gonna bring this bottom hand up, get some tension in my hands, squeezing the ball. We're gonna train hip cars in this position. Try and ensure the bottom leg in a straight line, in line with your shoulder and your ear. Start to flex that hip up. No lumbar motion's okay. Open that hip out. Internally rotate. It's gonna be a little more strict than you think in this sideline position. And just come on down. Reverse, extend back. Drive your knee and your foot up. Pull your heel under your knee, flex through slowly. If you need more balance, you can always bend that bottom knee up, might be easier there. Flex, knee towards chest, open that hip out, drive that knee away from the floor, then internally rotate, heel pulls behind you, decelerate down into extension, reverse back, extend, opening up, pulling through and decelerating. Let's flip sides, get that left hip. Okay, now I'm down on the right side, ball's going behind the left knee. Same thing, get some tension in those hands, try and ensure bottom leg is in line with the ear. If you need to regress, you can always train this from here in a bent leg position. Tension in those hands, squeeze that ball. Rep one, flexing up, opening that hip out. Do not swing, pelvis point stays squared forward, internally rotate, reach back, decelerate down. Let's reverse, extend back. Knee and foot drive up. Heel pulls under, control that deceleration through into flexion. Rep two, flex. Drive knee and foot out, go slow. Internally rotate, pull back, decelerate down. Extending. Knee and foot drive up. Heel pulls under, slow. Don't just swing that leg around. Keep tension like a side plank throughout the obliques, throughout the abs. Squeeze those hands to help you decouple that hip from spine. Internally rotate, reach back, reverse, extend. Drive that knee and foot up, pull through and decelerate. Okay, hip cars, the warm-up is done. Next up is actually train hip IR directly, a position that tends to be very limited. Okay, down supine, lying on our back. I'm gonna step the right foot nice and wide. That's gonna abduct my hip. From there, I'm gonna take the opposite foot, step it up onto my right thigh. I'm gonna use the weight of my top leg to passively internally rotate my right thigh. Notice how I let my outer foot pick up. Now, as I do this, we're only gonna go as far as we can that this right glute stays on the floor. If you go too far, you're gonna rotate. Now my pelvis point not pointing straight ahead. I've twisted through that lumbar spine, glutes off the ground. So only as much hip internal rotation as you got before you feel that glute start to lift up. That way we're actually isolating hip internal rotators and not the spine. Here, if you struggle in your cars to decouple hip motion from spine motion, building more internal rotation is going to be a key. More strength and control of that deep hip capsular tissue is how we can learn to disassociate and decouple that hip motion throughout our cars. So we're in the stretch. Your PALS effort, please stay here. What we're going to do is attempt to externally rotate this right hip. So you're gonna be doing this, don't move. You're in this position. You're gonna drive your foot into the floor as if your knee was gonna push your opposite thigh out. So push foot in, knee out. That's gonna be our PALS effort. Our rails effort is gonna be drag heel wider while trying to lower that thigh towards the floor without hiking. So push out of IR for PALS, pull deeper into IR for rails. 2 rounds in that hip IR. Get a breath in. Engage that tissue under stretch, that high lateral hip. Squeeze your glute, push your foot into the floor, drive your knee out into your opposite foot. You're trying to externally rotate out of the stretch, but you're not gonna move. Fighting right there. Increase your tension, 10-second effort, more. Foot into the floor, knee out. Glute should be screaming, ramping more effort. 5, 4, 3, 2. Rails is not just pull the knee away. Drag your heel wider and try and lower your thigh away. Foot wider, knee pulling down. Keep the glute on the floor, actively pulling into hip IR. Glute's gonna scream. 2, 1. Relax for a moment. 1 more rep. Lower that thigh down a little more passively. Use your top leg to get a little bit deeper into a stretch for those hip rotators. Breath in. Start your second round of PALS. Foot driving in, knee driving out. You're trying to rotate that right hip out of IR. 15 seconds, increase that tension each second. More effort, foot in, knee out, push. I want you to amplify the contraction. Try and get that whole glute involved. Get your abs involved. Keep pushing. Driving. 5, 4, 3, 2. Rails, heel pulling wider. Trying to get that inner thigh closer to the ground. Don't let that hip hike up. 2, 1, relax into it. Get a breath. Okay, flipping sides, let's get our left hip IR. Same exact setup. Lying on the back, step your left foot out nice and wide. Bring the right foot on top of the left knee. Use the weight of the right leg to passively internally rotate left hip. Allow that outer foot to lift up so it doesn't crank on your knee. Now, if I go too far, my glute lifts up off the ground. It is no longer just hip internal rotation. I've allowed that pelvis and that lumbar spine to rotate. So keep your glute on the floor. Keep both pelvic points squared towards the sky. Breathe into it for a moment. 2 rounds of PALS and rails. PALS trying to push out of IR. Rails trying to pull further into IR. Get a breath in. Generate tension in the tissue under stretch. That's your high lateral glute. Your foot starts to push into the floor. Your knee starts to open out into the opposite foot. You're trying to rotate your thigh through the ground against that opposite leg, increasing your tension, pushing more heel through the floor, more knee out. 5 more seconds. 3, 2, rails. Drag your heel wider, pull your knee towards the ground. Do not let your glute lift off the floor. Hold that effort and relax for a moment. Let the thigh passively sink. After each round, you should notice a little bit of increase in hip IR without that low back compensation. Remember, don't let it hike up. Keep that glute on the ground. Second round, a little more intense, a little bit longer tension. Start to drive that foot in, start to open that thigh out, 15 seconds. Increasing that tension each second, push, heel in, knee out, amplifying the contraction, trying to spread it from my high lateral glute throughout that whole hip into my abs, all the tissue nearby. 3, 2, 1, rails, drag the heel wider, try and get that knee closer to the floor. Don't cheat with that low back, and relax for a moment. If you struggle to decouple hip from spine, hip internal rotation isometric should be a staple in your training. Next up is going to be hip flexion, and there's a lot of ways we could do this, but the big thing we need to disassociate from is now pelvic tuck. It's very common as we max out hip flexion, the low back wants to round. Lumbar flexion is going to make it easier to get into that end range hip flexion. So what I want to do is train some hip flexion passive range holds, lying on our back. By lying on the back, you can't round the lumbar to cheat. Make sure here you're being strict though. It can crumple into the floor when you're lying on your back, so keep some tension. Join me lying on the back. So a passive range hold. Remember, we're going to grab the leg, pull as far as we can, knee to chest. Now, right about here, if I keep going, I feel my low back start to round into the floor. So I went too far. I'm going to back up a little bit, ensuring I can maintain the slightest bit of pelvic tilt. If I were to walk by, try and reach my hand under your low back, it should not be crushing into the floor. So if you can get thigh to chest, just make sure it's not coming from that low back. Now, be sure as well, you're not jumping too wide, knee away from the chest. Once you max out the position, pain is not okay. You can always back out if there's any pinch in the hip, would show you want to revisit that hip rotation training, probably some weak points there. In this position, tension to the bottom leg. We're going to slowly remove our hands, actively hold our thigh where it is. Ready? 3, 2, 1, move the hands and hold. No lag is okay. Squeeze thigh to chest actively. Grab back on, pull up another inch or two. Make sure there's no pinch in the hip. Make sure we're not crushing low back into the floor. Remove those hands and hold, hold. Feel that hip flexor working. Grab back on. You'll notice the slightest bit of lag as the hip flexor gets fatigued. Keep that leg narrow. Pull closer to chest. Remove those hands. Hold strong. And relax for a moment. We're going to flip around. Now, where would this carry over to our other movements? The awareness of hip flexion and pelvic tilt, if you squat, and you're someone when you squat, your pelvis always dumps under, that low back always wants to flex, that's showing you learn to couple lumbar flexion, pelvic tuck, with hip flexion. More strength in this end range hip will allow you to get deeper in your squats without that low back. So same exact drill, just facing the opposite way. Gonna grab one, tension to the bottom leg. Pull that left hip as far as you can to your chest. Try not to let it fake wide. Don't push into any pinching in the front of that hip. Make sure there's a slightest bit of pelvic tilt. If you have a pinch in the front of your hip, oftentimes it means you went too far into passive flexion and you allowed that low back to couple. Back up, find your pelvic tilt, not tuck. Do not push your low back to the floor. Keep it away from the ground slightly, and that will take some pressure off that anterior hip capsule. So, radiate hip flexor, start to back hands away, hold, hold. We're getting 6 reps. Pull one more inch into flexion. Make sure there's no low back. Helping out, remove those hands, hold. 3, 2, 1, grab back on. One more inch up into that range. Remove those hands and hold. Okay, done with flexion. Next up, hip extension. We're just gonna flip over on our belly. You need that tennis ball. So we're down prone, and next up we've got hip extension hovers. The big focus here is disassociating the thigh moving from the pelvis leaving the floor. Do not allow the pelvis to lift up. That would be that pelvic rotation we've been talking about. Throughout as well, we're trying to fight for a little bit of posterior pelvic tuck. Much easier if we allow anterior tilt. So, fighting for PPT and not allowing this right pelvic point to lift off the ground. So, ball coming behind the knee, gonna use that ball radiation in that hamstring. I'd like to go here, elbows pressing down. Squeeze that ankle, tuck that pelvis. We've got 6 reps, lifting the thigh up, hovering out a few inches, setting down, lifting up, coming back in, setting down. The hover here, very small. Imagine something the size of a pen or a pencil right outside the knee. That's where we're trying to hover. Pelvis tucked, tension in the arms, lifting up, hover out, decelerate. Up, in, and down. Take your time. Last one. Lift up, hover out, decelerate, coming back, up, in, and down. Okay, let's flip sides. Get that left. All behind that left knee. I like that goalpost hand setup. Might be a little bit easier to hear my cueing as well. Tension through that opposite leg. Pelvis is tucked. Try not to rely on too much extension in that low back. Squeeze that ball. Lift up, hover out, set down, coming back. Try not to be spastic with the motion. Again, smoothness. You may notice in these ranges of motion with less control that the nervous system wants to jump. Make sure you've got strength through every inch. Please join me in the frog stretch. So to get into the frog, please come to all fours. You're going to turn the feet out, slide both knees as wide as they'll go, drop down to the elbows. I want the hips in line with the knees. Make sure you're not sitting too deep into hip flexion. Make sure you're not sitting too far forward. I want to make sure we don't have too much spine extension, but we're also not flexed. So find what you would call a plank type position. And now we're going to work on those pelvic tilts in the frog. Now that our hips are maxed out that flexibility, can we still decouple lumbar spine, pelvis motion from hip motion? Bit of a challenge to finish out class today. So in the frog, you're sawing your elbows towards you, squeezing the head back, focusing on that pelvic tuck, starting by tilting the pelvis to the sky, finding some lumbar extension, tucking the pelvis to the floor. Remember, this is a small motion. You are not trying to do a global cat-cow. Just lift the pelvis, drop the pelvis. Continue, anterior tilt, posterior tuck. We're gonna do 6 of these. Lift the pelvis up, drop the pelvis down. Each rep, more awareness of where that TL junction is. Do not let those ribs flare. Anterior tilt, posterior tuck. Notice how much you feel the hips change. That sensation of stretch is different in anterior tilt versus posterior tuck. Okay, have a seat. We are all done with class, but I just wanted to highlight one thing. Everyone has different hips. We're all going to have different areas where we compensate. If we couple our hips in flexion versus internal rotation, extension versus abduction, doesn't really matter. What does matter is having the awareness of our movement patterns to know which positions cause our hips, our spines difficulty. Whichever drill you really struggled with today, those are the options you want to continue to work on. Work on those weak points. If it was very easy for you to do those hip extension hovers, that's not the one to take away as homework. But what I would suggest, keep chasing that pelvic tilt control, keep working on those pelvic rotations. The better and more awareness you have of where that lumbar is in space, where those pelvis points are pointed, the better you're going to be able to decouple the hip. If you feel like there's not enough workspace in the hip, those internal rotation isometrics for sure are one to revisit. But if the hip cars, there's good range, but they feel a little sloppy, they feel all over the place, more of the control focus. Chase your flexion. Use that control to carve out the ranges of motion you need. Hope you enjoyed class. Drop me some feedback.